Well, this first song that I want to talk to you about is called Thoughts on Thoughts, and I have it right here. When I was young in college, I would oftentimes end a semester at university by driving up the coast in California. That was kind of a way that I would reward myself. So I felt exhausted from the semester, did a lot of hard work, staying up till 2 a.m. and composing and writing and practicing piano. And so oftentimes I would just get in my car and I would drive up PCH, Highway 1. And it takes about 12 hours from Southern California all the way up to San Francisco, which is usually where I would stop. And of course I would stop along the way at little towns and I would just write. I would clear my head. I would go sit on the beach alone. I would just kind of let the breeze from the Pacific Ocean just kind of waft over me and just pacify me and kind of just refresh my soul. It was really, really inspiring. I found a lot of inspiration from that. And on one particular occasion, I stopped in a town called San Luis Obispo. Now, San Luis Obispo has this area of it called Morro Bay where there's this huge rock out in the ocean. And I remember I spent more time than I normally would in this town. So I sat down and in a little coffee shop and I just got some coffee, started thinking about some new projects I was going to work on. And after I was done, I walked down the street and found this tiny little hole-in-the-wall bookstore. I love finding little bookstores in towns that I visit. And in that town, they had in the bookstore rather, they had a little section for local authors. And so I was reading through some of the books from the local authors and I found this poet named Jeannie Greensfelder. Now, Jeannie was a poet. She lived in San Luis Obispo for a long time with her husband, and so she writes some really, really interesting and kind of quirky poetry. I've never really heard or read any poetry quite like that. So I ended up buying the book from the store and going back to my hotel and just kind of reading through it and really just laughing at some of the jokes in there and reading some of the sort of the nuances. And she has this wit and this humor about her where it seems like her poetry is going to go to a dark place, but then she quickly pulls you out. And I really liked that. I really enjoyed that. So when I returned back to Southern California after that trip, I decided to write 3 songs called Biting the Apple, based on her book of poetry called Biting the Apple. Let me read the text to you for one of them called Thoughts on Thoughts. The text starts out, "One cold day, drying myself after a shower, I noticed my wife's towel hung over a heating vent. If anything ever happens to her, I think I'd get the warm towel bar." So it's kind of funny, it's kind of quirky. You think there's a moment of reflection there where he's gonna say, "Oh, if anything ever happens to her, I'd be so sad." But in fact, we don't get that. We get, if anything ever happens to her, I'd get the warm towel bar. And it goes on to say, when I tell her my thought, she laughs at me and says, "I haven't pictured your demise since yesterday when you ate the last chocolate." So there's a little bit of a wit between the husband and the wife there, and I found that poetry was really inspiring, so I ended up setting it to text. Now, this was one of the very first songs that I've ever written. I was an undergrad, I was young, I think I was maybe 19 or 20 years old. And so I was really inspired by Frederick Shevsky and some of his music, and oftentimes when you listen to his music, you can tell that for the instrumentation, he uses a lot of piano and voice. And sometimes the text that he chooses is rather interesting, to say the least. He has some text that he's written from inmates, or some songs he's written from poetry from inmates talking about death row and very sort of weighty thoughts like that. And so I thought, I'm going to take that instrumentation, I'm going to write this for piano and tenor. So the first step was finding poetry that I really liked. The second step was finding the instrumentation, and this song was really simple. It was just piano and tenor. Now, the first thing I wanted to do when I started to read through this was I wanted to mark it out and say, okay, this is going to be one complete phrase. So oftentimes I'd read the text over and over and over again and see where I naturally needed to take a breath. So I said 1, cold day, drying myself after a shower. That was about as much as I could get in one breath. So that was a little apostrophe I put there to make sure that I would write in a breath for the singer. I went on. I noticed my wife's towel hung over a heating vent. And that was the next place that I marked out. It said, if anything ever happens to her, I think, and then I put a pause there just for a little space before the punchline. And then I'd get the warm towel bar was that final phrase that I was going to use in that section. So taking the text and actually changing it a little bit so that you can add breaths is going to be really important, especially when it comes to something for solo singers like a tenor or a soprano or something like that. If you're writing for choir, it's a little bit different because they can hide the breaths. They don't have to all breathe at the same time, so you don't have to be as cautious with the breaths. But for a soloist, it's really hard for them to sing for a long time, especially if they're singing really high or if they're singing really low in their range, because it takes more breath to sing in those ranges. So be very mindful of that when you're writing in the low range and the highest range for the instrument. Now, because this was my first song, I decided to write it for tenor, particularly because I'm a tenor myself. So I knew my range, and I knew that I wouldn't get into much trouble if I just wrote the song based on my own range. Now, oftentimes young composers like I was could get into some trouble if you, let's say, write for a soprano and you're not a soprano, then you might end up writing too high for that part, and the soprano might not be able to sing those notes. You get into rehearsal and you find out in the recording session or in a rehearsal that she's not able to sing those notes, and then you have to go back and rewrite them or transpose them down an octave, which will really mess with the overall shape of the melody. So talking to your soprano or your alto or your tenor or whomever you're working with is going to be really important before you actually start to set your music. That way you know, okay, even though I know that the tenor range is here, maybe someone has a slightly wider range, or maybe they have even a more truncated range. So talking to the soprano or your singer can be super, super helpful. And also they might be able to do things that you're not able to do. They might actually be able to breathe longer or sing longer without a breath. They may be able to get a really interesting tone that you like, or they may be able to do something very virtuosic that you can't do if you're not a trained singer. So always, always, always when you're working with a singer or an instrumentalist, make sure you know who they are and make sure you know their limitations, as well as a little bit of their, the things that they do well. It's going to help you out in the long run. So after you set the phrasing of all of the text, the next step in the process is actually to choose the melody based on the shape that you work with. So the first part, one cold day, drying myself after a shower. I felt like in that first phrase, shower went down. So I knew the phrase was going to end down, and shower felt like the climax or the climactic point of that phrase. So I set it starting with my lowest note first on G, one cold day. I jumped up and then went back down to G, drying myself, going up. Then after a shower is my highest note. It's a sixth between the G and the E. I've got that major sixth there, and the E is my highest note so far, dropping down to a C in the shower. So one fine day, drying myself after a shower. Now, one of the things that Shefsky does is he uses modes. So instead of just using a major scale or a minor scale, you get kind of a normative minor scale, but then he changes one of the notes so that it sounds a little bit quirky. It sounds kind of out of place. And so that's what I did with this. I used a G minor scale, but then I had a raised sixth scale degree. So instead of using E flat, I had a mode so that it was an E natural and a C natural, which is rather interesting. Think about that when you're also composing. Don't just go to a stock major or minor pattern, but see if you can find little nuanced scales, or by changing one note in the scale, it might actually create something a little bit more interesting for you and for the music and the musicians to listen to while they're singing and playing your music. Now, after you set the melody and you figure out the overall shape of each melody, it's time to actually set the harmony. So first off, find the lyrics, either by using your own text or in this case using poetry from someone else. And then set the melody, and then after that you want to set the harmony. And so in this particular case, I decided to actually map the melody to the harmony. And so instead of getting chords in the piano, I actually just wanted the pianist to play single notes, one in each hand, and they're just playing simple octaves, mapping what the tenor is singing. So as the tenor sings, "One cold day," that's exactly what the piano is playing, 2 octaves lower in the bass. We have the same G, G, B flat in the same rhythm. That way there's 3 octaves of the exact same thing happening. And I found that that was super successful for getting this kind of quirky feeling that I wanted, rather than the sort of normative, romantic feeling of having these really lush chords and the singer is just singing beautifully over the harmonies. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I wanted to do something different, something more modern, and something a little bit more quirky to fit with the text. So start with the lyrics, break them up into breaths, set a general shape based on the way you would read the text, then set the melody, and then set the harmonies when you're done. And oftentimes when you do that, sing through it a bunch of times, make sure you're giving a proper rest according to the breaths that the singer is going to need, and ultimately make sure that there is some repetition. The biggest pitfall you might fall into is just setting the text verbatim, but we'll look later on in another video about how important repetition is to get your point across. I hope this has been a really interesting video on setting text in a song with piano and voice. Take some time this week to listen to this song that I'll link below in the videos at the end of this course, and listen to it, maybe follow the score, and see if you can take something from that to use in your own music.